The Holy Gospel according to Luke, as found in the 10th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Christ.
Please be seated. The Good Samaritan. It's an expression used in many contexts to mean many things. We have Good Samaritan laws to protect individuals who give aid in an emergency from being sued. We have Good Samaritan hospitals, many of which offer care to people with low incomes and special needs. We even have the Good Sam RV Club, originally established in 1966 to make the roads safer for recreational vehicle drivers. And now they offer services that rival AAA. All of this and more come from the parable Jesus tells us in today's reading. A lawyer, an expert in the law, decides to test Jesus, to challenge the very lofty claims that Jesus has been making about himself. So he asks, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus responds to the lawyer's question with a question of his own and a challenge for the lawyer. Isn't the answer to your question written in the scriptures? And are you not, as a lawyer, an expert in the scriptures? How do you read it? The lawyer answers with a text that is basic to the Jewish understanding of life. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and your neighbor as yourself." "Good," says Jesus. "You've answered your own question correctly. Do this, and you will live." But the lawyer just can't leave it at that. He has to ask Jesus a second question. "And who is my neighbor?" So Jesus tells a story about a man who is having an aggressively bad day. We know almost nothing about this man who falls into the hands of robbers on the Jericho road. Jesus' audience no doubt imagined the man to be Jewish, but Luke's audience may have imagined he was a Gentile. He is identified in the reading only by what happens to him. He is beaten, robbed, stripped, and left for dead. The next 2 individuals we meet are just too easy to predict. First a priest, and then a Levite. Now, we know that they're not going to be the good guys in this story, because we know that Jesus doesn't get along with the temple crowd. Those hearing the story also know this, so they're not surprised when each of these men passes by and does not stop to offer aid. They expect the priest and the Levite to behave badly. which really helps to set up the zinger that's coming. You see, by ancient storytelling conventions, the audience expects a series of 3 characters, and they expect the third character to break the pattern of behavior created by the first 2. Since they know that Jesus has an anti-temple bias, they expect the sequence will be a priest, a Levite, and then an Israelite. The average, everyday, ordinary Israelite who will do what the priest and the Levite refuse to do for this poor man. But Jesus, as he so often does, goes outside convention and introduces a Samaritan. Samaritans, those unclean products of mixed marriages, certainly not Jews by any reasonable standard. In fact, the region of Samaria is shunned by Jews. They will go out of their way to take the long way around to avoid traveling through the region of Samaria because there's a risk that they might be tainted by contact with a Samaritan. By making the hero of the story a Samaritan, Jesus is challenging this long-standing hostility between Jews and Samaritans and clearing away traditional boundary expectations. You see, social position, race, and religion don't count for the man in the ditch. Anyone who has compassion and stops to help is his neighbor. I'm not sure that we can even begin to understand the level of shock that this lawyer and the others hearing the story feel at this lifting up in the status of a Samaritan. It's clear to us the Samaritan is good, the priest and the Levite are bad. But Jesus turns the question back to the lawyer. Which of these 3 was a neighbor? The answer is so distasteful to the lawyer that he won't even use the word Samaritan. Instead, he says, the one who showed him mercy. I did a little Google surfing this week on Good Samaritan stories, and I found some interesting stories about Good Samaritans. Now, many of these stories come from times of war, particularly World War II, when so many people risked their lives to help Jews escape from the Nazi death camps. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, saved more than 100,000 Jews by giving them false passports. Corrie ten Boom and her family in the Dutch underground resistance movement hid Jews in a counterfeit room in their house. Most of us have heard the story of Mieke Gijs, an Austrian woman who, along with her husband, helped to hide the young Anne Frank and her family in an Amsterdam attic. And of course, there's Oskar Schindler, who was immortalized in film, who spent his own fortune to save 1,200 Jews from the Auschwitz gas chambers. In all this surfing, the favorite story I found was one I'd never heard of. A man named Chiune Sugihara, a Japanese diplomat in Lithuania in 1940. At his wife Yukiko's urging, Sugihara, who was an Orthodox Christian, signed over 300 visas a day and saved more than 6,000 Jews from the Holocaust. His act of defiance ended his career as a diplomat, but many Jews today still remember Sugihara with deep affection and refer to him as the Japanese Oskar Schindler. But I discovered that it's not always clear who the good guys and the bad guys are in real life. Did many of you see the movie Schindler's List? I did not. So it wasn't until I was researching these stories that I found out that Schindler was also a member of the Nazi Party. Even in the parable that Jesus told, he never says that the Samaritan is good. That's a label we humans added later. Jesus simply says that this is the man who is acting as a neighbor, the one who is demonstrating his love of God by acting on his love of neighbor. The duty of neighborliness is an expression of the love of God and love of others, and those who show mercy show that they belong with the heirs of the kingdom. But the duty of neighborliness transcends any expectation of this kind of reward. The Samaritan certainly couldn't have expected any reward or repayment for what he did for the beaten man. The many individuals who stepped forward to help the Jews in World War II could expect no reward for their actions, only the possibility that they themselves would be imprisoned and even killed. Jesus says, go and do likewise. Don't expect anything in return, and don't judge those who are doing likewise around you. There are very few people in the world who are completely bad, and none who are completely good. Now, I'm looking down at my page number here, and I realize that this is the point in the sermon where I'm supposed to share some insightful way in which the reading ties into our daily lives. I'm reminded of a theologian, I think it was Karl Barth, Jim probably knows whether it was or not, who says that the pastor should preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. But the news the past few weeks has been pretty difficult to handle. I don't mind telling you that I have spent a certain amount of time weeping. Part of that has been exacerbated by personal issues. My dad's been struggling lately. But I'm also sad for our nation and for our world. Watching the news, even reading my Facebook feed, has become a daunting task these past few weeks. So what does Jesus' story of the Samaritan have to tell us about our nation and our world today and our place in it? I believe that it tells us something about what is expected of those who follow Jesus. When Jesus says, go and do likewise, I don't believe we can only apply that to the actions of the Samaritans. I think we have to look at the totality of Jesus' ministry. Throughout his time on earth, Jesus lifted up the most vulnerable in his society. If we are to follow his example, we must do the same by lifting up and caring for the most vulnerable in our society. The poor, the homeless, people of color, Muslims, women, children, the list goes on and on. All people who are routinely oppressed in our nation and in our world. Jesus says, go and do likewise. And as we look at his ministry, the way in which we do this will vary. For each of us, it will be different. But each of us must speak, and each of us must act. This is what Jesus did. He didn't include a Samaritan by accident. He knew how the Jews felt about the Samaritans, and he wanted to shatter that complacency and that stereotype among them. He didn't lift up Gentiles by going over to the Gentile lake of the Sea of Galilee and healing people over there by accident. He did it to lift up the Gentiles. He didn't include women in his ministry and bless children by accident. He did it to lift women and children up to the people around them, to show that they were not property and not possessions, but human beings like the rest of us. So each of us must speak and each of us must act to make this a world where no one has to be afraid because of the color of their uniform or the color of their skin, because of who they love or how or who they worship. Otherwise, we have to look at ourselves and ask just which Jesus we are following. Amen.